The Chernobyl nuclear disaster. What happened 37 years ago and are the risks still present? On April 26, 1986, the city of Chernobyl, 130 kilometers north of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, became the scene of one of the worst environmental disasters in human history. As a result of the explosion in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near the city of Pripyat, 50 times the amount of radiation equal to the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 was released into the environment. After the explosion, clouds loaded with radioactive material affected many countries including Turkey. According to some independent studies, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster directly or indirectly caused the death of approximately 200,000 people. Hundreds of thousands of children were born disabled due to the effects of the disaster, and cancer cases were claimed to have increased. The negative effects of the accident are expected to last for generations. The forest fire in Chernobyl, which started on April 4, 2020 and could only be brought under control after about 2 weeks, once again raised the issue of how much risk the traces of the nuclear disaster pose today. Ukrainian scientists, whose opinions we sought, pointed to different possibilities in this regard. Maxim Kremen, who worked at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986 and today is the president of the Union of Veterans of the Nuclear Energy and Industry sector of Ukraine, shared his memories of that period with us. When was the Chernobyl nuclear power plant built? The construction of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, then part of the Soviet Union, began in 1970. The city of Pripyat was built 3 kilometers away for the plant's personnel and their families. The first reactor unit became operational in 1977. With the subsequent completion of 3 more power units, annual energy production it reached 29 billion kilowatt-hours. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was planned to become the world's largest nuclear power plant with 12 reactors of 1,000 megawatts each. Before the explosion, the plant was operating with 4 reactors and 2 reactors were under construction. The fourth unit, which was involved in the accident, had been in operation for 3 years. What happened at the plant on April 26, 1986? On April 25, 1986, preparations for routine preventive maintenance work began at the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was planned to test the turbine generator to be used as an additional power source in the event of a future emergency. It was decided to carry out the test at a power level of 700 to 1000 megawatts. The day before the accident, the reactor's power was reduced to about 1,600 megawatts and the emergency cooling system was switched off for the test. At 23.10 hours, the power level started to be reduced to 700 megawatts. The automatic power mode was switched on, but as the power stop setting was not set to 700 megawatts, the power level dropped to 30 megawatts. The operator on duty tried to restore power and finally started the test at 200 megawatts, which was below the planned level. At 1.23 on April 26, the emergency stop signal lit up on the control panel. The operator pressed the reactor stop button and the control rods started to move downwards. The power level reached 100 times the nominal value within seconds. Workers involved in the construction of the reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1981. After the situation got out of control, 2 large explosions occurred a few seconds apart. According to eyewitnesses, a red flame rose in the first explosion and a blue flame in the second explosion, and then the plant was covered with a giant mushroom cloud. What caused the Chernobyl nuclear disaster? The actual causes of the biggest nuclear disaster in the history of mankind are still debated today. The State Commission established in the Soviet Union at the time to investigate the causes of the accident declared the plant personnel and management to be the main culprits. Plant manager Viktor Brukhanov and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin were sentenced to 10 years in prison, deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov to 5 years, reactor supervisor Alexander Kovalenko to 3 years, shift supervisor Boris Rogichkin and supervisor Yuri Loshkin to 2 years each for violating safety rules. Maxim Kremen, who was the manager of the personnel responsible for technical adjustments at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant at the time, and today is the president of the Union of Veterans of the Nuclear Energy and Industrial Sector of Ukraine, shared with us a memory he had the day before the explosion. On April 25, 1986, as I was leaving the plant after work, I accidentally bumped into Dyatlov and Kovalenko. Kovalenko approached me and said that there was something strange about the operation of the reactor. But Dyatlov stopped him sharply and did not allow him to continue. I did not dwell on it, because it was not my responsibility. Stating that he estimated that the reactor supervisor and the deputy chief engineer were aware of the problem in the reactor, Kremen continued as follows. The deputy chief engineer did not have the determination to give the command to stop the reactor. He was afraid of not being able to fulfill the experiment. The chief engineer was an electrical engineer by profession. In this situation, there was only one thing he had to do: stop the reactor. Despite their professional responsibility, they were afraid to take this decision. The International Committee on Nuclear Safety, INSAG, of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, initially agreed with the Soviet state. The INSAG report concluded that the accident was the result of a combination of rule violations and personnel errors, and accused the plant management of experimenting with all costs. However, in its new report on the accident published in 1991, the same organization concluded that the accident, which started as a result of the error of operational personnel, turned into a disaster due to the inadequate design of the reactor. In its final report in 1993, INSAG argued that some of the previous conclusions about personnel errors were wrong and that the accident was more likely to have occurred due to a design defect in the reactor, the failure of the reactor to meet safety standards, and the inadequacy of general safety measures at the nuclear power plant. There are also claims that the accident could have been caused by an earthquake, sabotage, or an act of terrorism, but there is no evidence of these. What were the consequences of the nuclear disaster? Maxim Kremen, who lived in Pripyat, woke up early on Saturday, April 26, 1986. He had planned to go canoeing on the river that day with his 6-year-old son. They drove to the garage 1 kilometer from the nuclear power plant. On the way, I met an acquaintance who worked at the plant. He told me that the roof of the 4th reactor had collapsed. I was shocked. When my son and I arrived at the garage, I saw smoke rising from the 4th block. When I went up to the roof of the garage, I saw a horrible picture. The lid of the reactor was lifted at a wide angle and the pipelines were hanging over it. So I decided to go home. My colleagues and I gathered at my house and started talking about the accident. It was impossible to get out of Pripyat. All minibuses were stopped and no private cars were allowed to leave. In Pripyat, April 26 was no different from any other day. There were no warnings or restrictions on daily life. People gathered in groups and talked about the accident at the plant. On Saturday evening, the party and municipal leaders of Pripyat took their families out of town. The news spread immediately. We were prisoners. On Sunday, they started taking people away. Everything was normal before the accident. People were buying cars and building their houses. They had hope. But a moment came and everything precious to them was destroyed. 1981, Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Sometime after the nuclear disaster, residents of Pripyat and a 10-kilometer radius around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant were evacuated. In May 1986, the number of people evacuated from a 30-kilometer radius is variously estimated at between 116,000 and 350,000. The fire caused by the accident lasted 10 days. About 380 million curie of radiation was released into the environment as a result of the explosion. An area of 200,000 square kilometers, 70% of which is located on the territory of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, was affected by radiation. After the accident, clouds loaded with radioactive material spread to many countries in Europe. How many people lost their lives as a result of the disaster is still a matter of debate. The nuclear disaster initially claimed the lives of 31 people working at the plant. However, the real devastating effects of the accident emerged later. According to some independent studies, the Chernobyl disaster directly or indirectly caused the death of approximately 200,000 people. According to different data, between 600,000 and 800,000 people in the Soviet Union took part in the work to eliminate the effects of the disaster. More than 70,000 of these people were permanently disabled. Maxim Kremen was one of those who took part in this work in 1986 to 1987 and was later awarded the Medal of Honor. The accident exposed 1.9 million people in Ukraine and 8.4 million people in Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe to radiation. After the explosion, all the pine trees near the plant turned red and died due to the high radiation. Almost all of the animals perished. How is Chernobyl today? Since the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986, an area of around 4,000 square kilometers has been abandoned. The exclusion zone covers the territory of Ukraine and Belarus. The city of Pripyat near the plant has turned into a ghost town. Agriculture is forbidden in the radioactive contaminated area and no new construction is allowed. There are police checkpoints 30 kilometers from the forbidden zone. However, despite this, the city has been the scene of robbery and looting acts many times so far. It is stated that there is hardly a single flat in the ghost town where valuables have not been stolen. The last functioning reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was shut down on December 15, 2000. The wreckage of the reactor, where the nuclear disaster occurred, was covered with a giant steel shield in 2016 to prevent radioactive leakage. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which is currently inactive, is operated by the state enterprise responsible for the safety of nuclear facilities and radioactive waste, environmental supervision, and scientific work. Projects to build a solar power plant and a nuclear fuel storage facility for Europe were also on the agenda. Chernobyl fire. The forests, which were exposed to high radiation after the nuclear disaster, have now turned into a paradise for natural life. Many wild animals and hundreds of bird species live in the region. Studies show that the high amount of radiation does not have a serious and negative impact on the wild nature of Chernobyl today. However, anomalies can be observed in some animals. For example, albinos are common among birds. Insects have shorter lifespans than normal, and rodents have lower fertility levels. The region where the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded and the city of Pripyat has been hosting tourists from all over the world in recent years. According to official data, 124,000 people visited the region in 2019, thanks to the series, Chernobyl, which attracted great attention all over the world. However, after the recent fire, 1/3 of the tourist attractions in Chernobyl were destroyed. One of the biggest losses was the burning of the Izumrudnoy Soviet youth camp, where the first liquidators lived after the 1986 nuclear disaster. What are the effects of the nuclear disaster today? Chernobyl came to the fore again with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which began in February 2022. Staff working at Chernobyl said that as of April 1, 2022, the Russian soldiers who had taken over the former nuclear power plant had left the area. The fire in Chernobyl, which started on April 4, 2020 and lasted for about 2 weeks, also caused concern. The fact that the fire progressed to an area 2 kilometers away from the city of Pripyat and the facilities where radioactive waste was located brought the risks related to Chernobyl to the agenda again. The most important negative impact of the disaster today is that approximately 1 million hectares of land in Ukraine and Belarus are under the influence of radioactive contamination. Ivan Kovalets, head of the Department of Environmental Informatics at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, NAN, says that controlling and burying the remains of nuclear fuel and radioactive materials are the main problems today. Noting that there is a large amount of radioactive material at the bottom of the cooling pool of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the academic points to the following risks. If the pond dries up, these radioactive materials can be released into the air by the wind. Forest fires in the Chernobyl region may also increase radioactive activity. To solve all these problems, a large number of specialists have to work in the region regularly. This poses certain risks to their health. Kovalets answered our question on whether fires in the region pose a serious risk as follows. Some radioactive waste repositories contain long-lived radioactive material. Therefore, of course, they pose a danger. However, since they are usually stored in reinforced concrete compartments, it is unlikely that fires will cause these materials to escape from the repositories. In storage facilities with nuclear fuel residues, and not only in Chernobyl, there is the possibility of an uncontrolled restart of a nuclear reaction, criticality accident. But this does not mean a nuclear explosion. According to Sergei Paskovich, Deputy Director of the NAN Institute for Safety Problems at Nuclear Power Plants, the radioactive waste repositories in the region do not pose a safety risk that could lead to the release of radioactive materials into the environment in the event of fire or floods and hurricanes. Both experts think that the radiation levels at Chernobyl do not pose a threat to human health in Ukraine and neighboring countries today. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, also announced in its latest report that the forest fires in the Chernobyl region did not cause a dangerous increase in radioactive particles in the air. The report stated that the increase in measured radiation levels was very low and did not pose a risk to human health. However, experts emphasize the need for more scientific research on the possible risks that the traces of the Chernobyl disaster, the biggest environmental disaster in human history, may pose today.